I'm going slightly off-piste today because this is not a video that's actually all about tarot. It's sort of it's stepping back a bit and talking about the context in which I read tarot cards and in which maybe you do too. My list of top 10 spiritual books. I think it's possible to read tarot cards from a completely atheistic point of view, but then on the other hand, I sometimes think, well, what's the point of having a completely atheistic point of view? I think you have to work quite hard to have one of those. There is so much that's unexplained, and there's so many interesting things happening in modern science, and we are so connected these days, and we're hearing so much from people around the world, for example on YouTube, who are talking about their own personal experiences. There's an interesting quote from Jane Roberts channeling Seth in one of the great Seth books, where Seth says there is actually more evidence for the reality of the afterlife than there is for the existence of black holes. It's just that that kind of evidence is very personal and it's experiential, and there's this feeling that it doesn't count. But anyway, enough of that. Let's just dive in. My top 10 spiritual classics, and I'm going to start with a kind of like a cheat, which is this thing here. There you go. And it's called 50 Spiritual Classics by Tom Butler Bowden. Basically, this is a starter, and you can hoover it up on the train between, Berlin and Paris, and it's just one person's idea of the 50 most important spiritual books. But it does give you an overview, and you don't have to read the books. You can read, about the books, and then you can get a feeling for what's out there and what sort of books exist in the world and are there for you to read if you want to. It's just everything, really. Gurdjieff, Khalil Gibran, Aldous Huxley, Hermann Hesse, Jung, Marjorie Kemp, Teresa of Avila, Mother Teresa, Ken Wilber. This is a very good overview, and clearly it didn't persuade me to read all 50 books, but it opened my mind to certain books that I hadn't really heard of before. And so in the case of each book, you get a kind of like a synopsis, and then he places the book in the context of the wider culture, and there are some quotations, and you get a feeling for whether you might like this book or not. And this book did lead me to some very interesting finds. So at number 10, 50 spiritual classics. Now at number 9, I've got this one here, The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying by Sogyal Rinpoche. I'm not a Buddhist myself. I'm not an anythingist, really. I'm one of these non-aligned people. But I think of all the religions or spiritual philosophies, I suppose Buddhism it does come across as the most sensible. I suppose maybe it just kind of resonates with us as Westerners. There's some sort of resonance, isn't there? And this book here, don't be fooled, it's not the Tibetan Book of the Dead, but it does talk about the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and it does talk about death. I mean, that's a bit somber, isn't it? But we are talking about, consciousness and reincarnation and the survival of consciousness after death. And so there certainly came a point in my life where I really wanted to know what the Buddhists had to say about death. I actually kind of disagree on some levels. I think my suspicion is they make it a bit more difficult than it needs to be. And I think that's the tendency of all religions. I think religions are structures, and as soon as you get a structure, you get sort of obstacles, don't you? And there's someone saying, oh, but you have to meditate. And if you don't achieve that level of meditation, then that could happen when you die, and then you could fall down that, pothole, couldn't you? But it's an immensely warm-hearted book. It's very compassionate. It's very touching. And even though I believe the author was involved in a scandal after it was written, I can live with that. Now, at number 8 is a book that's very close to my heart. And it's on the borderlines of being off-piste because, we're doing my video about spiritual books, and it's not strictly speaking a spiritual book. There's no ghosts, there's no gods and goddesses. It's called Non-Violent Communication. A Language of Life by Marshall Rosenberg. And I came across this book, I suppose, in my 40s when I was going through one of my, turbo personal development phases. And I was doing a lot of work with a group called Gay Love Spirit. And that's how I rediscovered Berlin. It was a German group. And they used a lot of cutting edge contemporary techniques for communication, for intimacy, and for personal growth. So it wasn't group therapy. I suppose if they had to go into any sort of camp, they would have defined themselves as a branch of coaching. It was all about helping gay men to live better lives, to feel good about their sexuality, to feel good about our sexuality, and to integrate it nicely so that it's possible to have a spirituality and a sexuality and not divide them. Anyway, long story short, the facilitators of these workshops, of these group events, were very well versed in the latest ideas. They were into NLP. Now, I'm not really one of those people who accuses everything of being violence, and I'm not really into pointing the finger and saying that language is violent and that concept is violent and you are inherently violent and this society is inherently violent and so on and so forth. But if you can get around that, it's not a finger-wagging book at all. It's really about a way of dealing with difficult conversations and a way of dealing with difficult communications and still communicating and not becoming conflictual and also not running away. Although one nice thing about this book is one of his principles is that you can always leave the conversation if you want. I have been very grateful to this book in certain difficult moments in my life where I've had to sit down and have very, very difficult conversations with people who wanted me to be a certain way or to do certain things or collaborate in certain ways, and I didn't want that. And so it was a conversation that was almost bound to be painful for either one of us or both of us. And in those situations, a lot of the times things can get sort of illogical and people stop communicating because people sort of get discombobulated. And this book contains basic principles of what he calls nonviolent communication and ways to kind of pick your way through conversations that might be kind of minefields. And it's designed to be used one-to-one between two people. He says it's also being used on a political or diplomatic level. If you have two countries who are at war, get their diplomats or their leaders to read this book, and then we'll all be living in a safer world. He even tells some extraordinary stories about hostages using non-violent communication with their captors, using these techniques with their captors. And even I think there's a story of a woman who gets attacked she's in a situation where she's been kidnapped and she might be killed or she might be raped, and all she's got is what she can say. And she uses the techniques of nonviolent communication to get through to her captor/abuser and to escape relatively unscathed. It's a long time since I read this book, and I might be relaying that story inaccurately, but it's an astonishing book, and it stays with you for the rest of your life. And once you've read it, and once you know what this concept of nonviolent communication is, because it's a very specific thing, it enables you to lead a different kind of life. And I do think that, in a sense, life is all about relationships, and relationships are all about communication. I recommend this book as a kind of like a basic resource to live a good life. And so I'm happy to put that under the umbrella of spiritual books. Okay, coming in at number 7, we have Gandhi's autobiography, or to be precise, Mohandas Gandhi, The Story of My Experiments with Truth. Now, I'm including this in my top 10 for a very specific reason, and I need to tell you a little story. My nephew did a university degree, I think it was in philosophy, and at one stage in his degree course, he had to write an essay about violence. And the question was, is violence ever justified? And my nephew's very clever. Of course he is. He's my nephew. And he did all his work, and he did all his reading, and he did all his research. And he sat down and he wrote his essay. And he came to the conclusion that no, violence is never justified. And his professor gave him a bad mark for this essay because that was the wrong answer. Actually, the correct answer, according to his professor, was that yes, violence is sometimes justified if you are a member of a group that is being oppressed. And so, my nephew was kind of outraged and he talked to me about it and I was outraged and I said, has your professor ever heard of Gandhi? And as we all know, Gandhi was a person who did not believe in violence and achieved an enormous amount in his life. As the old song goes, he freed a lot of people, but it seems the good die young. So I think it's not the most charmingly and colourfully written book in the whole wide world, but I think it's, it's the testament of a very, very important person. I mean, he comes across as a saint. He comes across as really extremely saintly. He's quite otherworldly. He's quite brainy and very, very pure. And I think he has very, very Spartan living habits and stuff like that. But, that's what he needs to do in order to get his life lived in the way it needs to be lived and to achieve what he needs to achieve. And I think it's just a book that everyone should read. And yes, it's a very spiritual book. So if you're at university and your professor says, yes, violence is sometimes justified because blah-de-blah-de-blah, because Foucault said so, you can say, oh, but what about Gandhi? Okay, number 6. I wanted to have something that was very, very current, sort of hot off the press. I wanted something that had been written in the past couple of years and was just giving us, if you like, a bulletin on what the state of the art is in terms of the spirituality discourse. So now we're diving into a really hardcore book. It's called The Afterlife Frequency by a man called Mark Antony. Mark Antony is an extremely interesting person. He's not a fantastic writer, but let that go. He's good enough for his purposes. He's a lawyer and he's also a psychic. So he's like a top lawyer and a top psychic. And he has helped the police with their inquiries by saying, yes, I'm picking up, yes. The murder weapon is under the sofa. And it's an extraordinary book. It's got lots of anecdotes in it and huge amounts of evidence, if you like, for the existence of the other dimensions. All evidence that would be thoroughly poo-pooed by the militant atheists. But I think if you want to hear about what a very, very highly psychic person has to say, and a very confident, very intelligent, very articulate, and in a sense, very worldly person, what this person has to say about the afterlife and the other dimensions, then I think this is a very good book. I think if you go back something like 100 years and you read books by spiritualists of the 1920s, and and further back or whatever, there's always this slight feeling of apology. May I please present what I believe might be the truth, and please don't be scared. I think with the linking up of the world with the internet, with things like YouTube and people getting to talk to each other and people coming out of the woodwork, I think psychic people are less prone to ridicule, I like to think. And I think there are certain tough nuts who are now extremely confident in what they're doing. And this guy, Mark Antony, is one of those tough nuts. And so he sort of lays it on the line. He tells you exactly how he thinks it works with this life, the afterlife, the communication between the various different worlds. And he talks about scientists who sort of also entertain these ideas. And he even talks about the cutting edge of science with regard to seeing if there will be technological ways of communicating with intelligences in other dimensions. And I think this is very interesting because I've always thought the thing about spirituality, the thing about heaven, the thing about God, the thing about telepathy, and all these things which are slightly off limits in your usual science classroom. It's all physical, it's all real, It all has scientific reality. We just don't know what the scientific reality is yet. And this book, The Afterlife Frequency, it basically, with great confidence, it sets out a theory of how all this stuff works. And I think it's a very nice book to have on your shelf. Next up, I Am That by Nisargadatta Maharaj. This is kind of like the best of Maharaj. It's a collection of edited transcripts of the question and answer sessions that he gave in his upstairs room over a number of years. Maharaj was an Indian shopkeeper who abandoned his wife and family to go out in search of truth, found it and came home back to the shop. And then I think after he'd found truth, I don't think he did much shopkeeping. I think his family had to do that. And he sat upstairs and people came from all over the world and climbed up the stairs to the little room at the top and asked him questions about the meaning of life. I've described that a bit sort of facetiously, but it is an extraordinary book. It's an extraordinary voice. It comes for me from a time in my life when I was pursuing a line of spiritual inquiry that I suppose you could say was a bit kind of, towards Zen, towards, well, they call it non-dualism, don't they? I mean, now we have non-binary, which is slightly different. But it's this very intense sort of philosophical way of looking for truth, as opposed to the softer, more kind of jolly ways, like, going for a cup of tea with someone at the College of Psychic Studies and talking to your grandmother on the other side. I think there are a number of different ways of finding truth or getting through to higher dimensions or higher frequencies and communicating with, in a sense, more highly tuned intelligences and consciousnesses. What in the olden days they would have called just, finding God. And I believe, it is acknowledged that there are various paths that you can go down. As I understand it, you can go down an intellectual route to finding God. You can search with the mind, or you can search with the heart. I also suspect personally that you can search with other bits of yourself. I mean, I imagine that you can search with the body. I mean, I imagine you could be motivated by your sexual/creative self. And I suppose that's what the tantric approach might be. So anyway, in my sort of journey, I have sometimes been more going towards the intellectual way of looking for God and the heart way. I think I've settled into the heart way for now. But from that period, I had a secular guru who was looking after my spiritual development, and he was giving me reading lists of all these very, very hardcore, brainy sort of Zen books to read. And I disliked almost all of them. There was maybe one real Japanese Zen text that I liked, and then there was this. And it's dialogues, it's question and answer, and it's just an extraordinary book. I can't quote from it because my friend Tom has borrowed it and we don't know where it is. But I defy anyone not to get something out of this book. The guy was, as far as I know, fairly uneducated, and he just was one of those people who woke up one morning and said, I'm not satisfied with the truth as it exists in my mental map. I'm not satisfied. I'm worried about what happens when we die. I don't understand how it all fits together, and I absolutely insist I want to know. And he just stayed with it, and he stayed with his sort of existential crisis, and then somehow he broke through and had extraordinary spiritual experiences, which he is very dismissive of. He says, "Oh yes, I meditated and I met various gods and goddesses, but I really wasn't interested. I just wanted to know the truth." And it's quite dry, and it's not really from the heart. It's really from the head. So it's not a route that I want to go all the way down to the end. No, thank you. It doesn't suit me. But I think everyone should read this book. Okay, at number 4, Rupert Sheldrake, The Science Delusion. Clearly a provocative title in answer to The God Delusion. And there are some hair-raising stories about Richard Dawkins in this book. Rupert Sheldrake is a fighter. And if you belong to the spiritual camp, as it were, spiritual camp, he's a really sort of wonderful person to have on your side. What's great about this book, The Science Delusion, is that Sheldrake gave a TED talk. So he appeared on the TED Talk show, talking about his new book, The Science Delusion. You know, he's a scientist himself, but he questions some of the basic beliefs of science, like, for example, the speed of light is always the same when you measure it. Apparently it's not. He says, is the total amount of matter and energy always the same? You know, all these sort of foundational things that we're taught to believe in by scientists. And he just says, you know, as a scientist, that, you know, it is known within the science community that these things are not entirely true. So he puts in a sort of like a wedge, and he sort of niggles around, and he disturbs this sort of monolithic and church-like scientific paradigm under whose yoke we are at the moment, for better or for worse. And so it's a polemic, in the sense that the God Delusion was also a polemic. Anyway, he gives a talk on the TED Talk show about the Science Delusion, and he briefly outlined 10 basic scientific beliefs that he claimed were false. And then there was a big furore, because there are what Sheldrake calls militant atheists in the world who kind of try to clamp down on dissent, and they go through Wikipedia, and if someone writes an article about kinesiology, they go onto Wikipedia and say kinesiology is known to be wrong. You know, so there is no God, there is no other dimension, there is no this, there is no that. And so anyway, the militant atheists rang up the TED producers and said, you know, this is anti-science. You can't have this TED talk online. So the producers, who didn't know what had hit them, they took it down. And then it became a scandal that Sheldrake had been censored. And you know, the TED Talks, the idea of TED Talk is that these are talks that question the paradigm, which was exactly what Rupert Sheldrake was doing. So he was giving the TED Talk par excellence, and he had been silenced by the atheists. So eventually the TED people, they reached a compromise. They created a special niche, a special corner of the TED Talks, I guess, website, called TEDx, I think, or TED Naughty Boys or something, or TED Evil, or TED Shouldn't Have Said That. And they stuck Sheldrake's talk in the Naughty Boys corner of TED. And of course, the scandal made the talk wildly successful and wildly popular. So great. It's a lovely book. It's his most polemic book, I think, and it contains quite a lot of material about how compromised science is, and how scientists sign their name to articles they didn't write in science journals, you know, for money. He talks about his dealings, personal dealings with people like Dawkins, and being stitched up in BBC documentaries and being tricked into saying things he didn't say. And it's depressing in a way, but it's also kind of exciting because he fights back. He talks about science as a church and as a kind of like a caste of people in our society, and he specifically refers to things that were written and said in the 17th century, where the scientists specifically set out to set themselves up as a kind of ruling caste over the rest of the population. And of course, Sheldrake questions this, as he should. But what is the most, I think the most riveting thing about this book is that Sheldrake posits or claims that memories are not stored in the brain, and that in fact a lot of our mind is not located in our brain. And this book is, it's outside the brain. It's non-locational, isn't it? And the brain just picks up information from the field. So this book is from 2012. It's 12 years old, and science is progressing. And if you go on YouTube and hear the latest scientific spiritual theories, you'll find that the most advanced theories coming out of science, the theory is that, yes, our mind is basically non-located and our brain picks up our mind. So, yeah, memories are not stored in the brain. And I think that's really interesting. I mean, he gives examples of like a guy who had water on the brain, and his brain was a tenth of the size of a normal human brain, and he functioned quite well. And there is no proof that memories are stored in the brain. You can't put an electrode into someone's brain and ping, trigger a memory. It doesn't work like that. So this is an extremely engaged book, and it'll probably make a certain kind of person very cross. But if you like to hear voices of dissent, it's one of the most fabulous books. At number 3, Black Elk Speaks. And I was turned onto this book by the 50 Spiritual Classics book. It's, again, it sort of feels like a book that you have to read. It's extremely upsetting and extremely touching. It's about the last days of the Native Americans' wars with the white settlers and their final defeat. And it was recounted verbally to a guy in, I think, the 1930s. And so Black Elk, the Native American speaker in this book, he is sort of born into an Arcadia, if you like, a hunter-gatherer society with all its culture and all its rituals and all its spirituality. And in the course of his life, modern America takes over, and you just have to read it. It feels like a voice from another dimension. It's a voice from certainly another era and a whole other way of living. There are descriptions of they go out hunting buffalo, and they kill a buffalo, and the little boys are following the hunt, the teens or the preteens, and on the way home back to the camp, the little boys are allowed to eat little bits of raw liver as a special treat, fresh out of the animals, probably still warm. And they love it. They love their little bits of raw liver as a treat. And you think, oh my goodness, what a different life. But yeah, it's very sad, but it's also very inspiring. And it is extremely spiritual, as you would expect. At number 2, one of my all-time favorites, Autobiography of a Yogi by Yogananda. And here he is. I was very lucky to pick this up on eBay or some secondhand book service, and I didn't really specifically ask for a first edition. I mean, it's not a valuable first edition, that's not the point, but it's a first printing. And I read the book, loved it. It's such a great book. And then later I was Googling online and maybe Wikipedia, and I read that he's a great spiritual leader, and he has founded a kind of like a whole movement. But he was a bit naive, and he basically set up this foundation to carry on teaching his ideas, and he sort of assigned the rights to his book to the foundation, to the people who were running his foundation. And then over the years, I think probably after he died, the foundation people rewrote this book, they edited it, they cut bits out to suit their purposes, and they changed some very crucial pronouncements that he'd made. What's the word? They gave bits of it a different slant. So I just want to say, hot tip, get hold of the first version of this. Just insist on the first version. This is an old thing, but, probably when it first came out, it was probably printed in the millions. So you can probably find a copy of the first edition. It doesn't have to be expensive, but read that. Don't trust the subsequent printings. The point about this book is that when the chips are down, it's incredibly charming. I mean, it's about this hardcore spiritual guy who he's just born and he just wants to be a yogi, and he just wants to, meet other saints and prophets, and he just wants to meet God and deities and Jesus and things. And he just goes about it like some people want to be a ballet dancer or, some people want to be a train driver, and he just insists. When he's a little boy, he runs away from home to go and visit a saint, and his father has to rush to the railway station and haul him back. And it's written in English in this insanely charming, rather old-fashioned, you could almost say slightly 19th century Dickensian Victorian English style, which I suppose is an Indian flavour of English. And I mean, readable, it's just readable like you couldn't possibly imagine. And it's also mind-blowing. And he makes all these claims about all the things that happened to him in his life. And you can believe it or not, but it's so warm-hearted that you just have to love it. So, a fantastic recommendation. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's number one. Number one. The Seth Material by Jane Roberts, the lady who channels Seth, the entity known as Seth, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Okay, so there are books in my list that have been life-changing. Nonviolent Communication was a life-changing book. I think The Science Delusion was a life-changing book. Some of these books were just very stimulating and were sort of have given me a bit of extra, I don't know, extra structure in my mind or in my heart. But the Seth Material I discovered quite recently, I suppose about 6 months ago. And I mean, the Seth Material is also the word for all this stuff that Jane Roberts channeled. Okay, Jane Roberts was a writer living in America, and she wrote science fiction, and she had an idea that she might like to write a book about ESP, like how to do ESP. And she didn't really know anything about the subject. She was just looking for a subject, so she did some research. She and her husband got an Ouija board and experimented with that. And they were contacted by an entity called Seth via the Ouija board. And they took some messages over a couple of sessions, and then suddenly Seth started to speak through Jane Roberts. And there's one existing video of Jane Roberts channeling Seth, and it's from a TV documentary, I think in the 70s. And it's quite extraordinary because she's this rather modest, seems fairly shy, you could say like a nice sort of librarian sort of lady in this simple suburban house. You know, sophisticated in her way and like with a very good vocabulary, and she was a good writer. But when she's channeling, she goes into trance and she doesn't remember what she said afterwards. People have to record it for her. When she's channeling, she becomes this extremely sort of archaic, almost scary figure. The voice goes down, the accent becomes strange and a little bit like Middle European. And it's a very intelligent voice. It's intelligent, it's funny, it's charming. It claims to be speaking from another dimension, and it claims to be speaking from another level of intelligence and consciousness, but it doesn't speak down to the listeners. It doesn't accuse us all of being ignorant sinners. It engages with the listeners on a very respectful and affectionate level. So in this regard, for example, I find it extremely different, the Seth Material, from, for example, A Course in Miracles, which I find quite, what Camille Paglia would call almost like hostile in its position, that it starts off by saying, you have to take this course. It is mandatory. You have to listen to this stuff. And, you know, this is Jesus speaking, and this is what happened, and this is from on high. It feels like it comes down from the mountaintop. And personally, I don't resonate with it at all, and I don't want to read it. Whereas this stuff, there are paragraphs that appear to be written in plain English, but then you get to the end of them and you think, what was that about? And you realize, okay, I did not understand what was being said. But it doesn't really matter, because you turn the page and you get to a page that is very clear and very rousing and very inspiring. So I think if you're spiritual at all, I think you need to check out the Seth Material. And this book, The Seth Material, is where Jane Roberts sort of introduces the whole thing. And then after this book, there were just books and books and books and books of channeled Seth Material. But I do think really one needs to engage with the Seth Material, even though I discovered it extremely late, because it feels like very foundational to the New Age. There are concepts in these books which they're not absolutely concepts that have never been heard before. There is always a tradition of thought in the world, but they seem to be seed concepts for the New Age, and they seem to have been built on by subsequent writers and even subsequent channelers. So it is life-changing. It really is mind-expanding. And if you're going to read any of the Seth stuff, I would recommend starting with the Seth Material, this one here, because it eases you into it gradually. the entity Seth said that, just to clear up any misunderstandings, he would only ever channel through Jane Roberts. And when Jane Roberts was alive, there were other competing channelers who came in and said, I've picked up Seth as well. But Seth said many times that, no, it's only Seth if it comes through Jane Roberts. And interestingly enough, like 50 years later or whatever it is, I was watching YouTube the other day, and there is a successful channeler coming up, I've forgotten her name, who claims to be channeling some sort of collective on the other side that includes Seth. So there's a little bit of Seth controversy, I think, brewing there, but I will look into it and I'll see if it's as bad as it sounds. Anyway, those were my recommendations. I hope there's something in there to pique your fancy, and happy reading, and I'll be back next week. Bye.